All right, so welcome to Friday Q&A. One of the first questions I had this week was with a patient. And a lot of patients don't ask this question, but ultimately we end up having to figure it out at some level. So his question was, how do I determine my daily protein needs? Protein can be a little confusing because you read a lot about it and you hear about how it's really important, or maybe you read that too much can be harmful. So it really depends on the person, just like everything else when it comes to nutrition, but I can give you some basic guidelines. So basically what protein is it's one of the three primary macronutrients along with carbohydrates and fats. And when you think of it in terms of calories, both protein and carbohydrate have 4 calories per gram. Fat has 9 calories per gram. And then alcohol is kind of its own special category that has 7 calories per gram. The reason protein is so important is because it helps build and repair tissues, so think muscle tissue. It actually helps us maintain our fluid and electrolyte balance. It provides satiety, so that keeps you fuller longer because it takes longer to digest. And protein actually helps transport other nutrients, micronutrients like vitamins and minerals throughout our system too. Also, if you think about it, a lot of really good protein sources like fatty fish have both fat and protein. And so some of our protein sources contain those superfoods like omega-3 fatty acids, which are also helpful for cardiovascular health. So as far as getting a number of how much protein you should aim for, a number is only helpful if you track your daily food intake, right? So I can give somebody a number, but that doesn't mean a lot unless they're either keeping a food diary or keeping track in an app like MyFitnessPal. And with a written food diary, you'd have to look up everything individually and also kind of weigh or measure your portion sizes. Same with MyFitnessPal. And that way you could kind of know how much protein you're getting to begin with. So tracking food isn't for everybody, and it doesn't necessarily have to be long term. It can be very tedious and kind of take away from other parts of your life. But sometimes when somebody's just getting familiarized with nutrition and macronutrients and how much they need, it can be a really helpful tool, because often we underestimate how many calories we eat and overestimate how much protein we get. So tracking is kind of a good first step just to see where you currently are. And then as far as getting a number for protein, you can use an online calculator to determine your daily energy needs. So basically, a calculator would ask you questions like your age, your gender, your height, your weight, your current activity level, and that's kind of a guesstimate too. And of course, these things fluctuate from day to day. And from there, it would give you your daily energy needs, aka your daily calorie needs. From there, for most healthy adults, about 35% of that number would be a baseline for how much protein calories you need. So about 35% of that total number would go towards protein calories. That's kind of a baseline. It could be more, it could be less, depending on different factors, which we'll talk about. Another way, kind of a quick way to determine your daily protein needs as a bare minimum would be divide your weight in pounds by 2.2. That will give you kilograms, which is what the rest of the world uses. And then your weight in kilograms multiplied by 0.8 would be kind of your minimum protein need. So that number, so your weight in pounds divided by 2.2 times 0.8 would give you a good baseline. So if you don't want to do the online calculator, that's another way you can determine a number. If you want to get really scientific and specific, you can calculate your protein needs off your lean body mass. But of course, that would require having an accurate analysis to find out what your lean body mass is. Lean body mass is like your muscle, organs, bones, not the fat mass. And then to do that, I can give you a few different numbers. Don't feel like you have to memorize these, but it just kind of gives you a general idea. So if you want to be more precise, you'll take your lean body mass, and then you'll multiply it by different numbers. So if you're sedentary, you would multiply your lean body mass by 0.5. If you're lightly active, like walking or gardening a little bit every day, that would be times 0.6. If you're moderately active, that's defined as 30 minutes of moderate activity 3 times a week. You'd multiply by 0.7. So as you can see, the trend is the more active you are, the higher your protein needs. If you're active, that's 1 hour of exercise about 5 times per week. You'd multiply by 0.8. Very active would be 10 to 20 exercise hours per week, multiply by 0.9. And if you're an athlete, they tell you to multiply by 1. So that would be your lean body mass times 1 to determine your protein needs. And of course, that can depend on what kind of athlete you are, what kind of training you're doing as well. So some considerations, especially here at the clinic, some patients will actually need a lower protein diet, so lower protein than those listed recommendations because perhaps they have chronic kidney disease or their liver enzymes are imbalanced. So in that case, we want to lower their protein because protein breaks down into a waste product called urea, and that can increase the workload on the liver and kidneys. So that is one instance in which you might want to have a lower protein diet, at least for a period of time. With chronic kidney disease, it's chronic, so you might have to follow a low protein diet for a longer amount of time. Other considerations, mostly, for the most part, unless somebody has a kidney or liver disorder, I find that most patients are a little bit low in protein, especially females. So you might need a higher amount of protein if you have a high activity level, like we talked about, and that can be both with endurance activities or strength. If you have a higher amount of muscle mass, some people just naturally have a higher amount of lean muscle mass. Maybe somebody has a goal of building muscle, maybe a goal of weight loss. Protein, since we talked about how satiating it is, it can actually help people lose or maintain their weight. Also, eating disorder recovery will need a higher amount of protein. Sarcopenia prevention, so again, a lot of patients here in the clinic are aging, they're under eating, and sarcopenia is when you have some muscle wasting and you lose muscle mass. Also, pregnant and lactating women will need more protein, and then also growing children. So they have a higher protein need based on their body weight. So some considerations too is when we think of protein, we think of a lot of animal-based products. But what we try to stress is getting your protein from a mix of plant and animal-based products. The reason being that with animal sources, protein will usually be more complete and have a higher amount, but then you also run the risk of raising your cholesterol because of saturated fat. Plant sources can give us protein, but usually you'll have to eat more of them. Then plant sources tend to be starchier. So if someone's trying to cut back on their carbs, that can be difficult too. So for most people who do eat meat or animal sources of protein, I like to help them find a balance of both plant and animal-based protein. For vegetarians, we can also kind of get more into how to combine different carbohydrates to make a complete protein, which basically means the different branched chain amino acids within the protein line up to give them everything they need. That's kind of a whole different topic, but I just wanted to mention that. Also, something to think about is when you increase your protein intake, you need to increase your water intake. We talked about how protein can break down differently. So especially people following a low carbohydrate diet who really increase their protein, they can get easily dehydrated. You might have to add some electrolytes to their water as well. An option for people with protein too is supplementation. I know for me, I do eat meat and animal products, but I'm also an athlete and very on the go. So for me, protein powders, protein bars, as long as I'm still getting protein from whole food sources, protein supplements have been really helpful for me to keep my protein needs met. And here at the clinic, we have really high quality, complete protein shakes that are soy-free, dairy-free, gluten-free. So those are an option for almost everybody. And that can be really helpful in trying to meet your protein needs. A lot of people think if they just eat really high protein, and cut out the other macronutrients, that they'll automatically lose weight. But if you're overeating any macronutrient, it can get stored as fat. So even protein, if you're overeating it, the body doesn't necessarily store protein like it does glucose and fat, but it can be converted to glucose and eventually stored as fat if eaten in excess. So the process is a little different biochemically, but it still can be stored as fat if you're overeating it. So that's just something to note. Also, one strategy I use for people who are trying to increase their protein but not necessarily increase their overall caloric intake is think about ways we can swap in protein sources for what used to be like refined or simple carbohydrates. So for example, maybe when you're eating a salad, you could do some chopped up hard-boiled egg instead of croutons, because that would swap protein for a carb without necessarily increasing your overall caloric intake. You could also just think about different ways throughout your day to swap out more protein for carbohydrate sources if you need an increase in protein. Most people get enough carbohydrate just because it's in all of our fruits and vegetables and grains and processed foods too, which can be part of a healthy diet. But especially like when I see my female patients, for some reason it seems like their diets tend to be lower in protein, and that could be the limiting factor in their weight loss goals. So I know for me, even when I'm less active or busier and sitting more, protein really does help fill me up more. And I tend to find myself snacking less if I don't need the snacks. And also it balances your blood sugar, so you feel a little bit less anxiety. Sometimes if you're eating too high in carbohydrate but not enough protein, you can feel more anxious or nervous or hangry. That hungry, angry feeling kicks in. So for beginners, I just try to identify what protein sources are. So from the animal family, that's any kind of meat, eggs, dairy products, and then from plant sources, even fruits and vegetables and things like that do have a really small amount of protein. That's another thing I want to mention quickly is most foods aren't just completely one thing. We call them a protein or a fat or a carb, but most foods are a combination of a little bit of all three, but we just label them according to what they are highest in. So like fruits we call a carbohydrate, but they will have a little bit of protein in them. But plant-based sources could be things like soy products. It could be, certain whole grains, like quinoa has an amount of protein in it, things like that. So again, it's kind of balancing out. Also, whole grain soy products, but don't forget beans, nuts, and then pea and rice-based protein sources. So like our protein shakes here in the clinic, for example, they derive the high protein parts of pea and rice and put them into a protein shake, and they can remove some of the carbohydrates. So that's kind of a cool source for people that have a hard time. For me, protein supplements are helpful because I don't feel like eating chicken for breakfast, or if I need something on the go, I can make a smoothie with the protein powder, and that's just an easier option for me. So yes, whole complete foods are best, but supplements can have a place. But kind of going back to the weight loss, especially in postmenopausal women, sometimes when adipose stores begin to build up at that time, hormones shifted, increasing the protein and then reducing the carbohydrate can help people lose weight if they need to or maintain a healthier weight. And also with protein, if it's helping build lean muscle mass, if you're working out, for example, like today in circuit class, where we're doing those micro tears to our muscles, which is actually beneficial, they need protein to rebuild stronger. And then if we're building muscle mass, that will give us a higher resting metabolic rate, which I know we've talked about a little bit in the past. But if you can build your metabolism and maintain that, that helps you burn energy throughout the day more so than if you have more fat versus muscle. So that's just kind of a quick synopsis on protein. There's a lot of different things we could talk about, but that kind of gives you just a nice overview. And since it is so confusing, I think it's just maybe good to track where you're currently at protein And some people don't want to do all those calculations or look at that. So for most people, like it really does depend on your body size, but if I had to give you just a flat number, I would say 60 grams a day is the absolute minimum. And a lot of people aren't even close to hitting that. So if you just want an easy number to start with, 60 grams is kind of like the lowest you'd want to be, unless you're maybe a very small person or just have those kidney conditions that we talked about. Any questions about that so far?
Can you have too much protein, like in a shot, like if you have the protein powder and then you do collagen on top of that? Would that be too much? You know, like if you do 2 scoops of a protein powder, your collagen says 2 scoops, and that's a protein as well. Is that too much, you know, in one shot?
Yeah, good question. So the amount of protein you ingest in one sitting also is a factor. Again, it's dependent on what you just did as far as your activity and also your body size. But that would probably give you about 30 grams protein if you're doing a couple of scoops of the protein powder plus the collagen. And that's okay. For most people, we say limit it to 40 or 45 grams per meal, because then your body might have a hard time digesting that protein load in one sitting. So for athletes, for example, we just try to spread the protein out over every meal and snack, because not only does it digest more efficiently, but it also is just easier for the body to process a little bit at a time. But 30 to 40 grams should be okay. Like if you were a larger male, you could probably do 50 to 60 grams in a sitting, but that would be like the maximum. But for what you're doing, that's perfectly fine, especially if it's post-workout, because post-workout your cells will pick it up a little bit more rapidly and utilize it.
If you do eat too much, what happens to you? Do you just feel sleepy or groggy or like heavy?
If you do eat too much, basically it can still get converted into fat stores, but it will kind of be like that postprandial hyperglycemia feeling where you do feel sleepy or having an energy crash. And just a little lethargic. You might get constipated, because a lot of times people who are eating too much protein aren't eating enough fiber because they're reducing their carbohydrates. So one thing we see a lot, one mistake we see a lot, is people who are eating a lot of protein, they aren't drinking enough water or eating enough fiber to sustain that load, and so their digestion gets kind of messed up. So that's another big red flag. Good questions, guys. All right, well, that's kind of all I have on that one for now. There's a lot more we could talk about as far as like food combining and things for vegetarians. But for the most part, you know, bottom line is just getting a mix of protein from both plant and animal-based sources. And an easy way to start is just making sure you have a protein source at every meal or every snack. Try not to eat a carbohydrate by itself, because that will definitely give you that blood sugar crash. And then I had another interesting question this week that I actually had to do a little bit of research on. I didn't know a lot about it. And this one was emailed to me. And the question is, what is Proprionate? So Proprionate I'd heard about before, because it is something that our body naturally produces in our gut microbiome. It's what's known as a short chain fatty acid, which usually is a beneficial thing for our digestion and our gut balance. However, Proprionate is also a lab-produced chemical that food producers have manufactured, and they put them in processed foods to prevent the growth of mold. So it's a preservative, so packaged foods don't grow mold. So the most common foods you'll probably see them in are things like prepackaged baked goods, frozen pizzas, some brands of yogurt, and then a lot of processed meats like sausages, and then some cereals, especially like the more sugary, less health conscious type cereals. So Proprionate is FDA approved, but there's been a lot of rat, dog, and human studies that indicate it can have harmful effects. So in the rat and dog studies, they found that the animals that ate Proprionate in their foods had increases in insulin resistance, glucose production, blood glucose levels, and also a pretty rapid weight gain in their bodies, which led to obesity after just a few weeks' time. Of course, rats are a little bit different than humans, but it was pretty telling enough that they wanted to kind of reproduce some studies in human subjects. So in the humans who were given propionate, they experienced symptoms like migraines, gut inflammation, but also a fairly rapid increase in the rate of type 2 diabetes, as well as those visceral fat deposits. So those are the dangerous fat deposits around our organs that we store in our midsection. So when they did the human studies, what they found out from a hormonal level is that the propionate can stimulate the hormone glucagon and norepinephrine and something called FABP4, which is a fatty acid binding protein. Normally, those hormones are released when we have low blood sugar. So those hormones help prevent a drop in blood sugar, but they also signal to your brain that you're in starvation mode, and it promotes the liver to produce more glucose. So if we're eating propionate and it triggers that hormonal cascade, even though we're eating calories and probably quite a few calories from the processed foods, it still tells your brain that you're in starvation mode and that you need to produce more glucose, which of course can lead to things like type 2 diabetes when consumed regularly. In the same study, they found that humans who ate the propionate-rich foods would take in about 500 extra calories per day versus the people who didn't. So some companies have taken a stand against using this preservative in their foods. In 2019, McDonald's removed it from all of its hamburger buns, for example. So some people are realizing the effects and taking it out of their products, much like trans fat a few years ago, where a lot of companies took trans fats out. But one way we can identify it in our foods is it is listed on the nutrition facts label. So by law, it has to be listed there. But it can go by different names, so you have to be a little bit careful and investigate your levels when you're buying those processed foods. So the list of names, most of them do contain the word propionate. So there's calcium propionate, sodium propionate, propionic acid, and then calcium dipropionate. But one that's kind of tricky is actually just calcium salt. So those two terms together, calcium salt, could also be a way that it's added to packaged foods. So that's something to look out for. That's kind of sneaky. Also be aware that some foods naturally produce a propionate type substance without it being added by a manufacturer. So like aged cheeses, for example, will have higher amounts of propionate, but it's likely not as harmful for you because it's not lab produced and added in excess amounts. It's just something that they naturally produce as a mold deterrent when they're going through that cheese process. So yeah, I thought that was a great question because I didn't know a lot about it, but it's just another thing to be aware of. And unfortunately, in the United States, things like that are more likely to be added to our foods versus other countries because the FDA does allow more substances than many other places. So just another thing to look out for on your label, and probably just another reason to limit our intake of processed foods altogether. So again, you can have them in your diet here and there, but just another reason to keep it simple and maybe limit those foods because we're always finding out things that aren't great for us in them. Let's see. Any questions about that? Have you guys ever noticed that before? Yeah, I'd never really paid attention to that one either.
Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, that one, I don't know. Caramel color is what I always look at. And
Yeah.
the one, it's in ice cream.
Oh, the carrot. Yeah, it's in some like almond milks and things like that too. Yeah, so it always feels like we have to be on the lookout. But yeah, usually the less processed the food, the better. So just another thing to add to our list. So those are just the two questions I got this week. So that kind of wraps it up for me. Do you guys have any questions?
I read that the food that has the highest amount of melatonin in it is pistachios. Do you know anything about that?
No, I haven't read a lot about that, but I think that's pretty interesting. So I should probably, maybe that could be one of my questions for next week is finding out which foods have the highest amount of melatonin and when to time them.
I just read that it was a good snack to take with you on long flights if you're trying to relax or adjust to time zone changes. But knowing how I had an opposite effect from melatonin supplements, and
Yeah.
it made me feel awake instead of rested. I was wondering about the natural sources, if it was the same compound and worked in the same way. But
Yeah.
pistachios taste good. So
Yeah. We buy the big bag from Costco and they go pretty quick. I guess you could experiment and see if you had pistachios on their own, if they made you sleepy or wired. But it's really interesting when we do supplements. We strip them of everything else. So like maybe pistachios in combination with the fat, fiber, etc., would have a different effect. So it's hard to say.
because aren't they pretty high in fat as well?
Yeah, they're high in fat and protein, and then different minerals too. So it'd be interesting to see if in combination with those things they had the same effect on you or if they would help make you sleepy.
And they're grown in New Mexico.
Yeah, my goal is to go to the pistachio land in Alamogordo someday. They do tours, so I really want to do that. And they have a giant pistachio statue.
And they have a great big gift shop with lots and lots of food made from pistachios.
Yeah,
Pretty
so
cool.
I think that'd be a fun little road trip to do after things kind of open back up and are back to normal-ish. Cool. Well, thanks, ladies, for joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.